I find myself always returning to the nature of zero, nothingness, infinity, the all, and especially negative infinity. I find myself unable to simply sweep the last one under the rug. I'll give you a problem to consider related to the subject of negative volume. Obviously, you know the formula for the volume of a sphere, and if you don't, you can easily look it up. If the radius is any positive number, then obviously the volume is positive too. If the radius is 0, then the volume is 0. If the radius is any negative number, then the volume is negative. You may object that a sphere with a negative volume can't exist in the real world. But some would say the same of spheres that have a volume of 0. But of course, as I and others have argued, such monads, or dimensionless points, or spheres with a radius and volume of 0, are the very building blocks of extended or solid objects which exist in dimensional space. If we accept the premise that the universe is mathematical, then we must appeal to the laws of math, rather than solely on our empirical observations of the material universe we perceive through the senses. What mathematical law forbids a sphere from having a negative radius? The formula certainly permits it. Furthermore, I find the concept of a one-dimensional line as a movement away from 0 problematic, because I accept that the equation we call the universe is equal to 0. If 0 is all there is, and all there is 0, which I and others have argued elsewhere, then a little bit of reflection, followed by a long moment of stupefied silence, will reveal the illogic of this. Surely you see it. If not, then I'm afraid I can't offer any demonstration, but try to think in pure geometry instead of in words, as strange as that may sound. I can't help but think of flatland here. If I talk about a sphere with a negative radius and a negative volume, it sounds like I'm describing a radius that goes into a dimensionless point instead of out from a dimensionless point. But one is no more absurd than the other, especially if we view the dimensionless vertex as representing the entire universe itself. I can only encourage you to meditate on it, but not too long, or else the abyss may stare back. If it offers you any consolation, I'm willing to grant that something like absolute value would probably apply to the sphere of the negative universe. It seems to me that within that universe, objects with a negative volume relative to the positive universe would probably appear to have a positive volume as well. I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but it's interesting to consider logos and mythos as representing the negative and positive volumes of the same sphere. Each sphere contains within itself its negative from its own perspective. Unlike others, I do not exalt one above the other, but rather promote an integration of the two. I consider an excess of either mythos or logos thinking to have its own danger. The danger of logos thinking is that a man may mistake his concept of reality for reality itself. This danger actually becomes greater, I believe, the more closely one's concept of reality approximates reality itself. I've referred to this as creating graven images. Imagine an idol that offers such an accurate likeness of God that God himself mistakes the idol for himself, and his spirit becomes imprisoned within it. We might think of the pure logos type as a colorblind scientist who studies color and has an almost complete scientific and intellectual understanding of it, but is unable to actually experience it. And we might think of the pure mythos type as a child who finds joy in coloring with crayons, but who doesn't even know the names of the colors. But I'm saying something even more nuanced than that. I'm going even farther. Even the man who experiences color is having a conditioned experience. His idea of the color red, his emotional and unconscious associations with the color red, and his past experiences of the color red, all separate him from the direct and immediate knowledge of red. Gnosis, as I use the word, is like dropping all of that. The knowledge of God can only occur spontaneously in the absence of beliefs about God. This is not my belief. This is my experience. This is what I know. And so the religion I preach is atheism. Atheism itself is the ultimate exoteric religion. Illumination, the ultimate esoteric religion, is the direct and spontaneous realization that the positive sphere you've known all along has been the negative sphere the whole time. The earth itself is Antichthon, the counter-earth proposed by Pythagoras. When a person experiences this realization, then there's only what is. There's only the absolute sphere, beyond positive and negative, whose radius and volume are the absolute value of infinity, and yet zero. We're definitely considering a topic that stretches the human intellect beyond its limits. And that's why I love this topic. This is where an individual finds the door to the sanctum sanctorum either locked or held open by an indescribably beautiful woman who lures him into this sacred mystery chamber. Logic is only the camel on which we ride across the desert, which would be impossible to traverse without its aid. But when we arrive at the mouth of the sacred cave, we must dismount and enter on our hands and knees like a baby. As for the camel, it can no more enter the cavern than it could pass through the eye of a needle. But I'm saying that logic ends in paradox. And I think that many of those who find themselves drawn to discussions like this one are drawn because they've arrived at some of the fundamental paradoxes of existence. Those who haven't yet embraced paradox will be disturbed, perhaps to the point of anger and violence, like the ancient Pythagoreans upon the discovery of irrational numbers. I don't fear being taken out on a boat and thrown overboard, like the infamous Pythagorean who discovered that the hypotenuse of a triangle whose legs are equal to 1 is equal to the square root of 2. I'll simply walk on water, either back to shore, along with those who have the faith and courage to follow, or else alone, even further out to sea where no boat can pursue me. Although I think I'm reasonably intelligent, I'm not going to be the next mathematical genius who surpasses Euler. I'm just not gifted with that particular kind of genius. Still, what I have said on the subject of mathematical theory seems absolutely certain and axiomatic to me. For example, 0 can be defined as the sum of any number and its negative. If any number exists, then any numbers which are part of an equation which is equal to that number must exist as well, since any such equation is a mathematical definition of that number. This is like saying that no whole can exist unless all of its parts exist. If 0 exists, then every positive number and its negative already exist as part of the definition of 0. Even before we extend an infinite number of radii out from the dimensionless point, each radius equal to infinity, it already exists within the point itself. And believe me, the language bothers me as much as it probably bothers you. It makes no sense to us to think of there being an inside of a dimensionless point. What I'm suggesting is that it's equally absurd to speak of there being an outside of a dimensionless point, or to speak of the universe as emanating from nothing or coming into being. For there to be an outside, there must be an inside. If you consider either to be illogical or impossible, then you must say the same of the other. I've heard some cosmologists suggest that on the other side of a black hole, there's a Big Bang singularity, and even that our entire universe may very well be inside a black hole, which I understand to be a dimensionless point. The implication of this is that any radius drawn from the center of the Big Bang singularity is in fact a negative radius from the perspective of the universe which created the black hole which contains our universe. Matter, then, isn't so much the extension of mind as the intension of mind. So if you want to find a rock with negative mass, simply pick up any rock you see around you. As an interesting side note, it appears that this paradox only arises in the third dimension. If you give the radius of a circle, a two-dimensional plane, a negative value, the area of the circle will still have a positive value, since the radius is squared, and any number except I becomes positive when squared. But finding the volume of a sphere, a three-dimensional solid, requires us to cube the radius, therefore making negative volumes not only possible, but inevitable. And if you assume a zero-sum universe, then it seems to me that you're forced to accept negative volume as not only a theoretical possibility, but as a necessary and contingent condition for the emergence and existence of positive volume. Whatever the total volume of the universe is, there must be a corresponding negative volume which, added to it, sums to zero. Otherwise, you're left to explain how something came from nothing. So if you think that what I'm saying is paradoxical, the alternative is no less paradoxical. There's no escaping it. As I see it, ultimate reality is fundamentally paradoxical. And I think this is true because, paradoxically, only a paradoxical reality, which can't logically exist, can logically exist. I think if you were to listen to my video, Dying Words of the Demiurge, in light of what I've said here, the geometrical and logos nature of my mythos storytelling will begin to emerge. Hypothetically, if you accepted the basic arguments I've offered, in what ways would this require you to alter your model of the universe? And is there anything that hypothetical, altered model might explain better compared to your current model? I'll leave that to you. Personally, I'm not one for building models. I consider them a form of idolatry. I consider this to be the esoteric meaning of the commandment, "Create no graven images." I realize that the formation of concepts, or cognitive schemas, is inevitable as the human mind seeks to understand itself and the world, and I'm certainly not against creating scientific theories. I'm only against the mind itself becoming imprisoned within a mental image of the mind itself, which the mind itself has created. And I view the entire universe as the mental creation, though not necessarily the intelligent or conscious creation, of a universal mind, seeking to form a self-concept. We can think of this universal mind as an unextended and dimensionless point, aside from which nothing exists. The formation and evolution of the self-concept becomes by degrees an increasingly perfect representation of the self. We might think of positive volume as the self-concept, and negative volume as the concept of the not-self. The formation of the concept of what the self is not is necessary to the formation of the concept of what the self is. You can't have one without the other. Both point toward the thing itself. But of course, no concept of a thing is the thing itself. In this sense, all concepts are false. But at a certain stage in the dialectical struggle between the self-concept and the not-self-concept, the self-concept becomes perfected to a sufficient degree that the self recognizes itself in the mirror of the self-concept, in a flash of self-remembering. And this is apotheosis, or gnosis. The self-concept is instantly dissolved. The danger is that if the self fails to leap across the abyss at the critical moment, it will identify with the body rather than the spirit and become imprisoned in matter, to use some familiar Gnostic language. I find this process easiest to communicate in mythical or mystical language, and I think that one advantage to this is that I think very few people are likely to take the image of reality I present for reality itself. They understand that it's only a camel. Logos systems, on the other hand, for some reason, seem harder for individuals to discard at the critical moment, when one must leap across the abyss. They become too identified with the camel, and find it impossible to renounce the wealth of the intellect in order to pass through the eye of the needle. Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.